She rose from that curtsy, already gone. By the time the Duke of Rivenhall understood the exact weight of the word he'd used in front of 300 witnesses, the woman he'd called a servant had built an entire life 2 counties away. One he would spend a full year trying to earn his way into. This is the story of a duke who lost everything he never knew he had in the space of a single careless sentence, and the year it took him to become worthy of getting it back. It begins on the last great ball of the season, inside the grandest room Rivenhall House had ever dressed for a single night. The ballroom at Rivenhall House had been built for exactly this kind of night, and it wore the occasion like a second skin. 300 candles doubled and redoubled in gilt-framed mirrors until the light seemed to breathe. Silk skirts sweeping across a floor polished to the sheen of black water, laughter rising and falling in waves that no single conversation controlled, and every conversation fed. Somewhere beneath all that brilliance, tucked into the narrow shadow behind a marble pillar where the candlelight thinned to almost nothing, Cassia Merrow knelt on the cold floor to fix the hem a young debutante had caught and torn beneath her own heel. Her fingers, quick, precise, practiced at 100 small emergencies, no one in that room would ever think to thank her for. No one glanced twice at her, and that, she had come to understand, was the particular and exhausting skill of her position in this house. To be present in every room and claimed by none of them, a pair of steady hands that appeared exactly when needed and dissolved back into the wallpaper the instant they weren't. 3 years of borrowed gowns retrimmed at the cuff, 3 years of rooms she moved through but never owned, had taught her with unforgiving precision exactly how much space a woman without fortune was permitted to occupy in a house like Rivenhall, and she had learned to occupy far, far less than that. She rose at last, smoothed the debutante's skirts with a final practiced tug, and stepped back into the deeper shadow of the pillar, just as the great doors at the far end of the hall swung open and the entire tenor of the room shifted. Voices dropping by half, heads turning as one, the whole glittering machinery of the evening reorganizing itself around a single entrance the way iron filings reorganize around a magnet. Cassia had come to Rivenhall 3 years ago as companion to Mrs. Bramwell, a widowed relation of the house too old for society's marriage schemes and far too sharp for its patience. And in the older woman's dry, watchful shadow, Cassia had found the closest thing to safety she had known since her father's debts had taken the roof from over her family's head in a single, humiliating winter. She was tolerated in these rooms the precise way a good clock on the mantel was tolerated. Useful, ornamental in her quiet fashion, entirely forgettable the moment she stopped being needed, and utterly unforgivable the one time she was not where she ought to be. She had stopped minding it mostly, or told herself she had. There was a peculiar freedom, she had discovered, in being unseen. No one expected greatness of a woman no one looked at, and so no one was ever disappointed in her, and no one's eyes followed her home to note the places where her one good gown had been let out, taken in, and let out again. She wore last season's blue silk retrimmed by her own hand at the sleeve, and if the stitches showed faintly at the cuff in the wrong light, she had long since decided that was a fact belonging to no one but herself. Tonight, though, something in her chest had refused to settle since the moment she'd dressed. A low, persistent unease she could not name and did not like. And she told herself firmly that it was only the heat of too many candles crowded into too small a space, the crush of too many bodies breathing the same warm, perfumed air. She did not yet have a better explanation, and some small, sensible part of her did not want one. Casimir Ashworth, Duke of Rivenhall, entered his own ballroom the way other men entered a battlefield they had already won. Chin level, shoulders set, dark eyes already cataloging the exits and the alliances and the dangers of the room in the single unhurried sweep of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything a crowded room could offer him. He did not dance. He had not danced in 4 years, not since the funeral that had emptied this house of whatever warmth it once held, and society had long since stopped expecting otherwise of him, folding his stillness into legend, the way it folds all inconvenient truths it cannot change. What he offered the room instead was presence, pure and unadorned, a tall, dark-coated column of quiet at the center of every gathering, commanding every eye in the hall precisely because he asked nothing of any of them. Mothers steered daughters toward him with the same bright, determined hope every season brought round again, and every season he received them with the same courteous, immovable civility, a wall dressed in perfect manners, promising nothing and revealing rather less than nothing. It was said, in the careful way such things were said, that he had possessed a heart once. It was said, more quietly still, in rooms he never entered, that he had buried it deep enough that even he had lost the exact location of the grave. He crossed the ballroom now with the flat, unhurried authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry for anyone, and the crowd parted before him the way water parts for a ship that stopped noticing the water a very long time ago, guests drawing back half a step without quite realizing they had moved at all. It happened in the space of a single indrawn breath. A footman's tray tilted a fraction too far near the refreshment table, caught by nothing more than the careless swing of a passing sleeve, and a full glass of claret went sliding toward the edge. And Cassia, closest, quickest, already moving before she had decided to move at all, caught the glass a bare inch from the marble, though a dark thread of wine still splashed loose across the floor and onto the hem of a passing lady's pale skirt. The Duke turned toward the small commotion with the sharp, automatic attention of a man responsible for every square foot of the room he stood in, and what his eyes found, in the half-second before judgment, was a plain-dressed young woman on her knees beside a spill, wine darkening her sleeve to the wrist, no one of any visible consequence standing near enough to claim her or explain her. He did not ask her name. He did not wait the half-breath it would have taken for an explanation to reach him. "See that this is cleaned at once," he said, and his voice, low and even, carried with terrible ease over the hush already spreading outward from the spill like ripples from a stone, "and fetch someone competent to manage the trays. This servant clearly cannot." The word landed in the room the way the glass had nearly landed on the marble, a small, precise, irreversible shatter, and for one endless, suspended second, no one in that vast, gilded room moved at all. Cassia felt the heat climb her throat in a slow, scalding wave, felt 3 careful years of practiced invisibility collapse all at once into a single blazing point of exposure, every eye in the ballroom finding her exactly where she had spent so long, teaching them not to look. She could have corrected him in that instant, could have given her name, her connection to Mrs. Bramwell, could have watched, if she wished it, his composure crack under the sudden weight of his own mistake in front of everyone he governed. Instead, she rose slowly, wine still spreading dark and cold against her sleeve, and sank into the deepest, most exact curtsy she had ever performed in her life, chin lowered precisely, spine straight as a blade, every line of her body a silent, devastating lesson in a grace he had just accused her, in front of 300 witnesses, of entirely lacking. It was not submission, whatever the watching room believed it saw. It was a door closing without a sound on a house that would never again see her arrive through it. The Duke's gaze caught on the gesture a half-heartbeat longer than it should have, some small, unplaced instinct at the base of his skull insisting he had just misjudged something considerably larger than a spilled glass of claret. But the thought passed before he could take hold of it. The orchestra resumed with mercy or indifference, he could not have said which, and the room, already hungry for its next distraction, began to turn away. That curtsy cost her nothing at all. It would cost the Duke of Rivenhall considerably more than he could yet imagine. The silence that followed the music's return was, in its own way, louder than the insult itself had been. Conversations picked back up in careful, glittering fragments, guests exchanging glances that carried entire unspoken paragraphs, and somewhere near the card tables, a woman in amber silk murmured to her companion that she hadn't realized the Bramwell companion was reduced to cleaning up spills with her own hands now, as though poverty and servitude were simply two names for the same slow disease. Casimir did not hear the murmur, and would not have thought much of it if he had. He had already turned back toward the matter that had drawn him across the room in the first place, a minor dispute between two merchants he was mediating as a courtesy to his steward, tedious and entirely forgettable. And by the time he reached them, the incident by the refreshment table had folded itself neatly and permanently into the back of his mind, filed away with 100 other trivial disruptions to 100 other evenings exactly like this one. He would not think of it again before he slept. He had, as far as he knew, no reason whatsoever to remember the plain woman in the retrimmed blue silk who had knelt so briefly at his feet. Monsieur Bramwell had watched the entire exchange from her seat near the tall windows, her cane resting against her knee, her face giving away nothing to the room around her, and she said not one word about it until the carriage was well away from Rivenhall House, the city gone dark and close around them, and Cassia sat very still with her gloved hands folded in her lap like a woman at prayer. "You curtsied," the older woman said at last, quietly, and it was not offered as a question. "It seemed the correct response," Cassia answered, and her voice came out level, almost pleasant, which frightened Mrs. Bramwell considerably more than tears would have done. She had known this girl 3 full years, had watched her absorb every small, grinding diminishment that Rivenhall's glittering world had to offer with the same patient, composed endurance, and she recognized now, in that unnatural evenness, something she had never once heard in Cassia's voice before. Not hurt, though the hurt was surely there beneath it. A decision already made. "Cassia." Mrs. Bramwell reached across the narrow space of the carriage and closed her weathered hand over the younger woman's cold one. "Whatever it is you are thinking of doing, I beg you, think of it once more before dawn." But Cassia had already thought it through, far more thoroughly than Mrs. Bramwell could yet know, in the endless space contained within that single curtsy. She did not weep that night, though she had half expected to when the carriage first pulled away from the house. She sat instead at the small writing desk in her borrowed room, the candle burning low and guttering in its own wax, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like peace after the noise of the evening, that she had spent 3 years making herself smaller and smaller in the hope of being safely overlooked, and that the man who ruled this house had just told her, in front of everyone who mattered to him, exactly how completely she had succeeded. It was not rage that moved her hand steadily across the paper, though rage would have been so much easier to explain to herself. It was something far quieter and far more final. The particular, settled calm of a woman who has stopped waiting to be seen correctly by people who never intended to look, and has chosen instead, deliberately, to simply stop being seen at all. By the time the candle finally guttered and went dark, the letter addressed to Mrs. Bramwell lay sealed upon the desk. The small trunk in the corner stood closed and ready, and Rivenhall House slept on in its gilded ignorance, having no notion yet of precisely what it stood to lose before the sun rose over its silent gardens. Long before Rivenhall, long before borrowed gowns and rooms she did not own, Cassia Merrow had been a different kind of daughter. The only child of a vicar with more learning than sense, a man who had mortgaged his small parish house twice over to fund a scheme that promised to triple his savings and instead erased them entirely, taking the roof, the furniture, and what remained of the family's standing in a single ruinous winter. She remembered, with the particular clarity of old wounds, how quickly the neighbors who had once praised her needlework and her singing had begun instead to speak of her only in terms of usefulness. A clever girl, a capable girl, a girl who would surely find a position somewhere, as though capability were the sum total of what she had left to offer the world. She had been paraded, in those first desperate months, before every family friend her father could still claim, not as a daughter to be cherished, but as an asset to be placed. Competent, biddable, unlikely to complain. No one had asked what she wanted. No one, in all the years since, had asked what she was capable of beyond the narrow use they had already decided to make of her. And she had told herself so many times that this no longer wounded her that she had almost come to believe it. Tonight's word, servant, had not created that old wound. It had simply reached down, with terrible accuracy, and found it exactly where it had always been, waiting. Before the household woke, before even Mrs. Bramwell's own maid began to stir the banked fires downstairs, Cassia made her way once more to the small glass conservatory at the eastern edge of the house, a neglected, half-forgotten room that had belonged, everyone said, to the late Duchess, and that no one since her death 4 years ago had thought to enter. Cassia had found it by accident in her first month at Rivenhall, half its orchids already dying of thirst and neglect, and had taken on their care as quietly and unofficially as she took on everything else, asking no one's permission because she suspected, correctly, that no one would have thought it worth granting. She watered them now for what she understood, with a strange ache, to be the last time. The pale moon orchids the Duchess had apparently loved best, the deep violet ones that bloomed only in early spring, each one labeled in Cassia's own careful hand on small ivory tags, because the original labels had long since faded past reading. She left, propped against the largest pot, a single folded page of instructions. Watering intervals, light requirements, which blooms wanted turning toward the glass, and which did not, written in the plain, unadorned hand of someone who had never expected credit for the labor, and did not intend to ask for it now. It was, she thought, closing the conservatory door softly behind her, the truest portrait of herself that Rivenhall House would ever possess. A small, exacting kindness, offered to something the house itself had forgotten it once loved, and never signed with her name. She thought she was only saying goodbye to a room full of flowers. In truth, she was leaving behind the one clue that would eventually undo everything the Duke believed about that night. By the time the last card game broke up in the drawing room and the final carriages rattled away down the gravel drive, Cassia's small trunk stood already closed and corded in the narrow servants' passage nearest the side door, and she sat fully dressed on the edge of her bed, watching the candle burn down toward the small hours of the morning, with the patient stillness of a woman who had made her peace with waiting for exactly one more thing. She left no note for the house at large, only the single sealed letter for Mrs. Bramwell resting on the writing desk, and she took nothing with her that had not been hers before she ever set foot inside Rivenhall's gates. No borrowed jewelry, no gift ever pressed upon her by a household that had never quite decided whether she belonged to it. When the clock in the hall below struck 4, she rose without hesitation, gathered her cloak and her trunk, and let herself out through the same side door she had used 1,000 times before, into a night still black enough to hide her and cold enough to steady her resolve. She did not look back at the house, as the hired cart rattled her away toward the posting inn and the first coach south, though some small, stubborn part of her had half expected she might. There was, she found, remarkably little left in that direction worth turning around for. Dawn came to Rivenhall the way it always did, pale and unhurried over the eastern lawns, gilding the dew on grass no one but the gardeners would notice, and the house woke to its absence of her with the mild, irritated confusion of a machine missing one small, essential part it had never troubled to name. The under-housekeeper found the writing desk in Mrs. Bramwell's rooms bare of its usual morning correspondence, already sorted and ready by Cassia's hand each day before anyone else had risen, and simply assumed, with a shrug, that the task had been overlooked. It was Mrs. Bramwell herself who understood first, reading the sealed letter with hands that did not quite steady themselves, that overlooked was precisely the wrong word for what had happened. That a woman who had spent 3 years being systematically unseen had finally, deliberately, removed herself from a house that had never once thought to look for her. She said nothing yet to the Duke. She was not entirely certain, in that first hour, that she trusted herself to say it without saying a great deal more besides. Casimir Ashworth, for his part, noticed nothing of the sort at all that morning. He had risen at his usual hour, reviewed his usual correspondence, and gone about the ordinary business of a man who governed a great house without the faintest suspicion that anything essential to its running had gone missing in the night. It was 3 days before the absence began to register as anything more than an inconvenience easily solved by reassigning a task to someone else. The first sign was small and almost comic in its pettiness. A stack of correspondence left unanswered on the study desk, growing steadily taller because no one else in the household had ever been asked, formally, to manage it, and no one now quite knew whose responsibility it had been in the first place. The second sign was the conservatory, where a footman sent to fetch flowers for the dining table returned empty-handed, reporting with some confusion that half the plants in that glass room appeared to be dying of thirst, and that no one on staff could say who had been tending them before. Casimir, informed of the second matter by his exasperated housekeeper, walked to the conservatory himself that afternoon, out of nothing more than mild irritation at having his household's smooth operation disrupted, and stood for a long moment among his late mother's orchids, most of them still miraculously alive, each one labeled in a small, careful, unfamiliar hand he could not immediately place. He found, tucked half-hidden beneath the largest pot, the folded page of watering instructions, and read it twice before the handwriting resolved itself, with a slow and unwelcome certainty, into a memory of a woman in retrimmed blue silk, dropping into the deepest curtsy he had ever seen. He asked that evening, with a carelessness he did not entirely feel, who had been responsible for the conservatory these past years, and the answer came from an unexpected quarter. Old Hensley, who had served as head groundskeeper at Rivenhall for 30 years and had little patience left for delicacy. "That'd be Miss Merrow, Your Grace," the old man said, not looking up from the boot he was polishing. Mrs. Bramwell's companion. "Kept those orchids alive better than the Duchess's own gardener ever managed, if you'll forgive my saying so. Kept half this house running quiet-like, truth told, and never asked for so much as a thank you for it." Casimir said nothing for a long moment, turning the name over in his mind, Miss Merrow, and finding, to his considerable discomfort, that it fit itself neatly and immediately onto the face he had spent 3 days trying not to remember, wine-stained sleeve and all. He asked, with rather less carelessness this time, exactly how competent a household companion Miss Merrow had been. Hensley's answer, delivered without any particular malice and precisely for that reason all the more damning, was simply that the house had run a good deal more smoothly with her in it than it appeared likely to run without her, and that it was a great pity, in his humble opinion, that some folks never noticed what held a place together until it came apart. The doubt Hensley's words had planted did not leave Casimir alone that night, nor the next, growing instead into something considerably more urgent than curiosity, a cold, creeping certainty that he had made an error of some significant magnitude, though he could not yet have said precisely how large. He summoned Mrs. Bramwell to his study the following morning, and asked her, without preamble, where he might find Miss Merrow, prepared to offer whatever correction the situation required. Mrs. Bramwell regarded him for a long moment before answering, her expression giving away considerably less than he had hoped for. "She left Rivenhall 4 days ago, Your Grace," she said finally, "before dawn, without leaving an address, and without any apparent intention of being found. I do not believe she left in anger. I believe she left because she had finally understood, with perfect clarity, precisely how little this house valued her, and decided she was no longer willing to wait for it to notice otherwise." Casimir sat with that answer far longer than propriety strictly required, turning it over in the silence of his own study, and understood, too late as such understanding so often arrives, that the woman he had dismissed in a single careless sentence had been, in every practical sense that mattered, holding up a corner of his own house that he had never once thought to look at. He believed a single conversation with Mrs. Bramwell would settle the matter. What he did not yet understand was how far a woman can travel once she has stopped waiting to be noticed. The second revelation came not from Hensley, but from Mrs. Bramwell herself, 3 days after the Duke's visit to the conservatory, when Casimir finally summoned the courage to ask the question he had been circling for the better part of a week. Not merely who Cassia Merrow had been to this household, but who she had been before it, and what precisely she had endured to arrive at Rivenhall's side door with nothing but a trunk and a widow's charity. Mrs. Bramwell answered with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, laying out the vicar's ruin, the mortgaged parish house, the long procession of relatives who had passed the girl among themselves like a debt no one wished to fully claim, until at last she had landed here, in a house that had proven in the end no different from any of the others. What struck Casimir hardest was not the poverty itself, which was common enough in every ballroom he had ever attended in one disguised form or another, but the sheer, accumulated weight of a life spent being useful rather than valued. A woman who had learned so thoroughly to make herself smaller that an entire household of people who owed their daily comfort to her hands had somehow failed, collectively and for 3 consecutive years, to learn her name properly enough to use it with any warmth. He thought of his own late wife's orchids, dying and neglected until a stranger's uninvited kindness had kept them breathing, and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle low in his chest that he was reluctant, even now, to name as shame. "I did not know her," he said finally. And it was not quite a question, though Mrs. Bramwell answered it as one regardless. "No, Your Grace," she said, not unkindly, though there was nothing in her tone designed to spare him either. "You did not. I do not believe you knew the names of half the people who kept this house standing around you. I believe that is precisely the problem Miss Merrow has decided to remove herself from." He began his search quietly, in the manner of a man unaccustomed to searching for anything he had not already been handed, and quickly discovered that quiet inquiry was a considerably more difficult skill than he had assumed it would be. He could not simply send men to every posting in and coaching route south of London without inviting exactly the kind of speculation he most wished to avoid. A duke, publicly humiliating a woman at his own ball, and then chasing after her within the week, was precisely the sort of story that would delight every drawing room in the city for a full season. And he understood, with the particular clarity of a man protecting something he had only just begun to value, that Cassia would want no part of being made a spectacle twice over. So he moved instead through smaller, more careful channels, A discreet letter to a former steward now managing a neighboring estate. A quiet word to the rector who had once served her father's parish before it was sold to settle debts. A coachman's memory jogged with coin rather than questions. Piecing together, fragment by fragment, the outline of a woman who had apparently vanished from every record that might have made her easy to find. It was slow work, and it left him, more than once, sitting alone in his study long past midnight, with a single sheet of notes that told him considerably less than he needed, and considerably more than he had ever bothered to learn about anyone in his own house. He told himself, in these long hours, that his purpose was simple correction, an apology owed, a wrong publicly committed, and therefore requiring public repair, nothing more elaborate than that. He was not yet ready to examine why the thought of failing to find her had begun to cost him actual sleep. Lady Cassia Merrow had watched the Duke's uncharacteristic distraction with the sharp, practiced attention of a woman who had spent 3 full seasons positioning herself as the only sensible candidate for a title she considered rightfully overdue to her, and she did not require more than a fortnight of his absent replies and unexplained errands to understand that something had shifted dangerously in a direction she had not accounted for. She had heard, of course, the story of the ball. Everyone had, but she had dismissed it at the time as precisely the sort of minor unpleasantness that solved itself, a servant girl put in her place and promptly forgotten, and it had not occurred to her, until his continued distraction proved otherwise, that the Duke himself might be the one unable to forget it. She approached the matter with the same cool calculation she brought to every campaign she had ever waged, arranging to be seated beside him at 3 consecutive dinners, steering every conversation toward subjects designed to remind him of her own considerable advantages. Her father's influence in the house, her fluency in French and Italian, her unimpeachable connections on both sides of her family, and watching, with mounting and carefully concealed frustration, as his attention drifted regardless, present in body and entirely absent everywhere it mattered. "You seem distracted of late, Your Grace," she observed at last, over the second course of a dinner he had barely touched, her smile pleasant, and her eyes considerably less so. "Forgive me," Casimir replied, with the flat courtesy he extended to everyone these days who was not the specific person he was looking for. "I have a matter of some importance occupying my attention." Cressida smiled wider and began, privately and without a shred of scruple, to consider precisely what manner of matter could possibly be occupying a duke's attention so thoroughly, and what she might do to ensure it did not occupy it for very much longer. The trail led him, eventually, to a modest market town 2 days' travel from Rivenhall, where the vicar's old rector remembered a family connection. A distant cousin of Cassia's late mother, a seamstress of some local reputation, who had taken in the occasional stranded relation when circumstances required it. Casimir arrived unannounced, dressed with deliberate plainness in a coat that bore none of Rivenhall's crest, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, a stranger asking after someone else's help rather than a duke commanding it. What he found there surprised him more than he had prepared for. The seamstress, a stout, sharp-eyed woman entirely unimpressed by his careful anonymity, spoke of Cassia not as a burden once endured, but as a genuine gift to the household she had briefly passed through. Quick with a needle, quicker with kindness, the kind of girl who noticed when a neighbor's boots had worn clean through at the sole, and quietly found a way to mend the problem before anyone had to ask. "She's not here now, sir," the woman said, eyeing his fine boots with open suspicion. "Moved on a fortnight past to a position further north, I believe, though I couldn't rightly say where. And I'll thank you kindly not to press me on it until you tell me what business a gentleman such as yourself has with a companion of no particular fortune." Casimir gave her, for the first time since the ball, an entirely honest answer, that he had wronged the young woman badly, in public and without cause, and intended to correct it if she would permit him the chance, and watched something in the seamstress's guarded expression soften, though not so far as to yield the information he had traveled 2 days to find. He might have found her within the week regardless, had Cressida Marlowe not learned, through a maid indiscreetly paid for gossip rather than loyalty, the general direction of his private inquiries, and decided with characteristic decisiveness that the matter required more direct intervention than dinner conversation alone could provide. A letter reached the seamstress's household 3 days after Casimir's visit, written in a hand disguised as a concerned family friend, suggesting delicately that a certain young woman recently in residence there ought to be warned that a gentleman of considerable rank was making inquiries after her whereabouts. Inquiries that might, the letter implied, without quite stating it outright, prove considerably less honorable in their intent than they first appeared. The seamstress, already protective of a girl she had grown fond of in a fortnight's brief acquaintance, took the warning seriously enough to write ahead to Cassia's new employer, urging discretion, and the effect was precisely what Cressida had calculated. A fresh trail gone cold, a household on guard, and a young woman who moved on again within days of receiving the warning. This time leaving no forwarding address with anyone at all, Casimir arrived at the seamstress's door a second time to find the woman considerably less forthcoming than before, her earlier softening replaced by a wary formality that no explanation of his could fully dissolve. He left that town no closer to Cassia than he had been a fortnight prior, and considerably more troubled by the sense, correct, though he could not yet prove it, that someone closer to his own life than any stranger on the road had begun actively working against him. Cressida believed the matter was settled. She had no way of knowing that every door she closed on him would only make the one he eventually found matter more. It was Mrs. Bramwell, in the end, who found the final thread, through a correspondence network of widows and companions that stretched considerably further than Casimir had ever thought to imagine existed beneath the surface of society's more visible arrangements. A former companion of her own acquaintance, now settled in a small coastal village, wrote of a new arrival helping run the parish's reading circle for the village's unmarried women and servants. Quiet, capable, unusually well-spoken, for a woman claiming no particular family, with a gift for steadying anyone who came to her unsettled, that the whole village had begun to remark upon within a month of her arrival. Casimir traveled the final distance alone, without escort or announcement, and found her at last not in a ballroom hung with crystal, but in a small stone schoolroom smelling of chalk and sea air, kneeling exactly as she had knelt the night he first failed to see her, this time gathering a scattered stack of primers from the floor, patient, unhurried, entirely unaware that the door behind her had opened. For a long moment, he simply watched her, struck by the strange, quiet completeness of the scene. A woman who had built, in a matter of weeks and from nothing at all, precisely the kind of belonging that his own vast house had never once managed to offer her. She looked up at last, some instinct drawing her attention to the doorway, and the color drained slowly from her face as she recognized him standing there. Plainly dressed, hat in hand, wearing an expression she had never once seen him wear across 3 years, and a single, unforgettable curtsy. "Your Grace." Her voice, when she found it, was steady in a way that told him immediately she had rehearsed this possibility, somewhere in the quiet hours of her new life, and had decided in advance precisely how much of herself she intended to offer him. She rose, smoothed her plain wool skirts, and did not curtsy this time, a small and deliberate omission that landed, he suspected, exactly as she intended it to. Miss Merrow. He had prepared, across 2 days of travel, a careful accounting of everything he wished to say to her. The apology, the explanation, the slow unraveling of what Hensley and the seamstress and Mrs. Bramwell had each taught him about the woman he had dismissed in a single sentence, and found, standing in the doorway of her small borrowed schoolroom, that none of it arrived in the order he had planned. "I have spent months searching for you, to say that I was wrong, and that the word I used that night was cruel and untrue, and that I have thought of very little else since." She studied him for a long moment, the low afternoon light falling across the scattered primers between them. And when she spoke again, her voice carried no triumph and no particular warmth either. Only the flat, considered honesty of a woman who had already decided what she would and would not accept. "You are not wrong to apologize, Your Grace," she said, "but an apology is a sentence, and I have built an entire life out of the space your house never offered me. I find I am not eager to trade it for a better sentence." He returned the following week regardless, and the week after that, taking rooms at the village's single modest inn and making no secret of his presence. Though he was careful, deliberately, painstakingly careful, to offer nothing that resembled the grand, sweeping gesture his instincts kept urging him toward. He did not offer her a return to Rivenhall as its future duchess in his second visit, sensing correctly that such an offer would land as precisely the kind of rescue she had already told him she did not require. Instead, he brought, on his third visit, a small potted orchid cutting from his late mother's conservatory, carried carefully the entire journey north, and left it with her without ceremony or explanation, saying only that the conservatory had been dying before she arrived in his household, and had very nearly died again after she left it. Cassia accepted the orchid in silence, turning the small clay pot over in her hands, and said nothing for long enough that he began to wonder if he had misjudged the gesture as badly as he had misjudged the woman herself 3 weeks before. "You remembered which ones needed turning toward the light," she said at last. And it was not quite forgiveness, but it was, he understood with something close to relief, the first door she had opened to him since the ballroom. He left the village that evening, having secured no promise, no declaration, nothing that could be reported back to society as progress of any recognizable kind. Only the quiet, hard-won understanding that whatever he hoped to rebuild with her would have to be constructed the same slow way she had rebuilt her own life. One small, unglamorous, consistent act at a time, with no guarantee at all that it would be enough. He did not return to Rivenhall that autumn, choosing instead to take rooms in the village for the better part of 2 months, a decision that raised eyebrows among his own staff, and considerably more among the gossiping circles of London once word of his prolonged absence inevitably reached them. He made himself useful in small, deliberately unremarkable ways, repairing a fence at the parish school with his own hands one gray afternoon, sitting quietly at the back during the children's lessons without once drawing attention to his rank, walking Cassia home each evening at a respectful distance she had not explicitly invited, but had also, he noticed, stopped explicitly discouraging. He asked nothing of her in those weeks beyond her continued tolerance of his presence, and offered nothing grander than consistency itself. The same measured, unhurried attention day after day, no letters promising eternal devotion, no jewels arriving by courier, only a man who kept showing up in the same quiet way, regardless of whether she smiled at him or looked through him entirely. Mrs. Bramwell, informed by careful correspondence of his continued residence in the village, wrote back a single dry line that he found himself returning to more than once. Consistency is the only apology she will ever believe. Everything else is merely words dressed as feeling. By the 6th week, Cassia had begun, almost against her own better judgment, to save him a chair at the small kitchen table where she took her evening tea, and if neither of them remarked upon the gesture aloud, both of them understood precisely what it meant. The test came, as such tests so often do, without warning and at the worst possible moment. A letter arrived from Casimir's man of business, informing him that his presence was required urgently in London, where a parliamentary vote of considerable consequence to Rivenhall's tenant farmers hung in delicate balance, and that his absence from the capital for 2 full months had already begun to cost him political capital he could ill afford to lose. In the same week, word reached the village, through channels Cassia later suspected, correctly, led back to Lady Cressida, that the local vicar's wife had begun whispering about the impropriety of a duke lodging so long near an unmarried woman of no fortune. Threatening the modest reputation Cassia had only just begun to rebuild for herself among people who had come to genuinely respect her. Casimir faced, that week, precisely the choice his old self would have resolved without a second thought. Return to London, protect his political standing, and quietly distance himself from the village until the gossip cooled, as any sensible duke managing his reputation would do. Instead, he called on the vicar directly, in full daylight and without disguise, and stated plainly and publicly that his interest in Miss Merrow was honorable, long-standing, and not a subject open to the parish's speculation, before riding to London himself to settle the parliamentary matter in 4 days of relentless, uncomfortable work, rather than the 2 weeks it might otherwise have taken. He returned to the village a full day earlier than anyone expected him, still travel-stained, having chosen, visibly, publicly, at real cost to his own comfort, to protect her standing rather than his own convenience, and Cassia understood, watching him dismount in the fading light, that this was the first real answer he had given her since the ballroom. He had already chosen her reputation over his own comfort once. London's grandest ballroom was about to ask something far harder of him than that. The true reckoning, however, came not in the village but back in London 3 weeks later, at a grand ball held once more in the same storied room, the same chandeliers, very nearly the same 300 guests who had watched Cassia curtsy in humiliated silence 8 months before. Casimir had asked her, this time, formally and with her full knowledge of what it would cost socially, to attend as his guest, and she had agreed only after he promised her, without her needing to extract the promise, that whatever happened in that room would happen in the open, not behind closed doors where it could later be denied. He did not wait for gossip to circle the room this time. Early in the evening, before the dancing began, he crossed the same floor he had crossed 8 months earlier and addressed the assembled guests directly, his voice carrying the same flat, commanding authority it always had, though the words it carried now were entirely different. "Many of you were present the last time Miss Cassia Merrow stood in this room," he said, "and many of you heard me call her something she was not. Out of carelessness, I have spent 8 months regretting. I wish to correct that error publicly, as it was made publicly. Miss Merrow is a woman of considerable intelligence, kindness, and quiet strength that this household benefited from for 3 years without ever properly acknowledging it, and I would consider it an honor if she would allow me to court her formally, with this entire room as witness." The silence that followed was, this time, an entirely different kind of silence. Not the shocked hush of a woman humiliated, but the startled stillness of an entire ballroom, recalibrating its understanding of a story it had thought it already knew the ending to. Cassia did not answer him immediately, standing very still in the pale green gown Mrs. Bramwell had insisted on gifting her for precisely this evening, and for a long moment, the only sound in the vast room was the faint hiss of the candles, and 300 people holding their breath in unison. She was not thinking, in that moment, of triumph or vindication, though both were surely available to her had she wished to claim them. She was thinking instead of the 6 quiet weeks in the village, the fence mended without fanfare, the chair saved at her kitchen table, the 4 hard days he had spent in London protecting her name rather than his own comfort, the accumulated weight of small, consistent, unglamorous proof that had done more to earn this moment than any single grand speech ever could have. "You are asking in front of everyone this time," she said at last, and her voice, though quiet, carried easily in the profound stillness of the room. "Because the last time you spoke of me in front of everyone, you did not think I deserved to be asked anything at all." It was not quite forgiveness yet, and both of them understood that. It was, instead, an acknowledgement, the first public one either of them had made, that something real had grown in the space between his mistake and this moment, built by nothing more dramatic than time and attention faithfully given. "Then let me ask properly," Casimir said, and for the first time in longer than most of the room could remember, the Duke of Rivenhall knelt. Lady Cassia Merrow watched the entire exchange from beside the refreshment table where she had once dismissed Cassia as nothing worth remembering, her carefully composed expression the only thing standing between her and the considerable humiliation of having her own campaign so thoroughly and publicly undone. She approached Cassia directly before the evening ended, not to apologize. That was not, everyone present understood, a gesture Cressida's pride would easily permit. But to say, with the brittle honesty of a woman who had finally run out of strategies, that she had underestimated her, and that she supposed there was nothing further to be done about it now. "I sent the letter to the seamstress," Cressida admitted quietly, watching Cassia's face for the reaction she half expected and did not receive. "I am not sorry it delayed you. I am sorry, I think, that it did not work." Cassia considered her for a long moment, weighing the several sharp responses available to her, and chose instead the quieter one that cost her nothing and gave Cressida nowhere to retreat to. "I hope you find something of your own worth fighting for as honestly as I found mine," she said, and turned back toward the room without waiting to see what Cressida made of it, leaving the other woman standing alone beside the refreshment table with no rival left to blame and no strategy left to attempt. Cressida left Rivenhall's ball within the hour, and society noted, within the season, that she had quietly redirected her considerable ambitions toward a wealthy widower in Bath, who wanted, as it happened, precisely the kind of sharp, capable wife she had spent years learning how to be. The formal courtship that followed lasted the better part of a year, at Cassia's explicit and unbending insistence, and Casimir honored the pace without complaint or visible impatience, understanding by then that the year was not a punishment, but the actual, necessary work of rebuilding something he had nearly destroyed with a single careless sentence. Among his first acts once the courtship became public was a letter to the seamstress in the market town, thanking her for the kindness she had shown Cassia, and assuring her that the suspicion she had rightly felt toward a stranger asking after a vulnerable young woman had, in the end, been answered honestly. He proposed properly in the spring, in the same glass conservatory where the orchids she had once tended in secret now bloomed in open, deliberate abundance, kneeling a second time beside the very cutting he had carried north to her a year before, now transplanted and thriving alongside its parent plants. "I am not asking you to complete my house," he said, turning the small ring in his hand, "or to forgive what happened in that ballroom, though I hope in time you might. I am asking you to choose me, the way I have spent a year learning to choose you, not because it is convenient, or because it corrects an old mistake, but because I have come to believe you are the truest thing I have ever been given the chance to know." Cassia looked at him for a long moment, at the orchids blooming around them, at the year of small, unglamorous proof that had brought them to this particular room, and understood that this, finally, was a door opening rather than one closing. "Then yes," she said simply, and the word carried, in its quiet plainness, considerably more weight than any grand declaration could have managed. They were married the following autumn, not at Rivenhall's great cathedral, but in the small stone parish church of the village where Cassia had spent her evenings teaching the reading circle its letters, at her own insistence, with Mrs. Bramwell seated in the front pew and Hensley the groundskeeper standing awkwardly at the back in his good coat. Present because Cassia had specifically asked for him, the reception that followed, held at Rivenhall itself for practicality's sake, filled the same ballroom that had once witnessed her deepest curtsy and her quietest humiliation, transformed now by an entirely different kind of attention. Guests who sought her out deliberately, who used her name, her actual name, with the warmth reserved for someone genuinely valued, rather than merely tolerated. Casimir found her that evening in the glass conservatory, drawn away from the celebration by old habit, tending an orchid that needed no tending at all, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching her the way he had watched her a year before, in a schoolroom smelling of chalk and sea air. "You do not have to hide in here anymore," he said gently, and Cassia smiled, straightening, the pale green silk of her gown catching the last of the evening light. "I am not hiding," she said. "I am simply visiting the one place in this house that saw me clearly before you ever did." She took his offered hand and walked with him back into the light of the ballroom. No longer the woman who vanished into its shadows, but the duchess who had taught an entire house, one quiet season at a time, precisely how much space she had always deserved to occupy. If this story stayed with you, if you believe grace can be a woman's sharpest answer to cruelty, subscribe to Dukedom Stories for more tales of dignity, patience, and the price a proud man pays to earn back what he nearly let walk out the door before dawn.